tidbit. The Magna Carta, which if you ever learned anything about the history of the Constitution, that's what they talk
Right.
about. The Magna
Mhm.
Carta was because of Prince John. It was between Prince John's the one who signed it, King John at that time, because he was, historically speaking, a petty, sometimes cruel ruler. Reception on him now is mixed. As a king, they're like he was okay. As a
Yeah.
prince, people have mixed views because he did start a rebellion. So yeah, that is historical fact. Like he did try to usurp King Richard while he was gone. Was there a Robin Hood character who, just made his life miserable? There's no record of that. But that's also partly because the historical characters that are closer to what Robin Hood is existed 150 years after King Richard, which I thought I thought that was interesting. I thought that was, for some reason they popped this guy back 150 years or 200 years, however long it was, to a different time.
So
And I
you're
don't know
telling me
why.
that this movie's not completely historically accurate?
No, man. I'm sorry. They didn't wear tights. That wasn't until the 1800s.
And I learned about that in my freshman year, our freshman year at Baylor. I'm not sure if you have the same costume. I think we did have the same costume
Yeah, I think
instructor.
we did.
She talked about their stockings. They didn't come up with the area to grip the undercarriage. I'm not sure what you would call that, the underwear portion, until much later. So it was just hosiery.
I was reading too, like the costume of Robin Hood comes specifically like what we see in film from the 1800s. It was boys' roles. So in a similar way, and you can see it like Peter Pan wears the same thing as Robin Hood, and it's because those were roles played by boys or women, depending on the time and then the place. But that's why they wore tights, and that's why all the merry men wore tights, was because of that theatrical tradition, which I thought was interesting because that's the whole joke now, is they're the merry men in tights,
Right.
They're jumping.
It's like they didn't really wear tights.
No, they didn't really wear
exist at
tights.
that time.
It's too cold to wear tights in England and the Middle Ages. You'll get
I know, and
pneumonia and die.
in Sherwood Forest,
Sherwood
without
Forest.
underwear.
Yeah.
It
And
wouldn't have
Sherwood
worked.
Forest is a real place, and Nottingham's a real place, and there are real sheriff of Nottinghams. That was something I thought was interesting in this movie. Is every time I've seen Robin Hood, obviously the big villain is Prince John, but his main henchman in a lot of retellings is a sheriff of Nottingham.
Okay, it's not Guy of Gisborne.
It's not Guy of Gisborne. No, I think if I remember correctly, I mean, I know that's the case in the Kevin Costner version. I think it's the case in the Disney version as well. They kind of, in a lot of cases, I think they kind of mix the two characters, because when you're either moving very fast paced or you are catering to children, those two characters serve a similar function. So you get rid of one of them. But like, it's always, I feel like it always is, one of them kind of submits to the other. Like this one, the Sheriff of Nottingham shows up late in the movie, if I remember correctly. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a character in this legend. Because Guy of Gisborne is from the beginning. You're like, yep, that's the main baddie. Like this is the guy who, if someone's going to kill Robin, it's him. And I thought that was interesting. I thought that was cool. I think, I don't remember exactly where the Guy of Gisborne character comes from, but obviously the Sheriff of Nottingham comes from it being a real place and there being real sheriffs.
Like Andy Griffith.
Yeah, exactly. Mayberry.
So can you explain to me and explain to our listeners like the difference between Saxons and Normans, where they originated from?
Yeah.
Do you know any of that information?
I do.
Okay.
Not much. There is differences, and actually historically, when this time is set, a lot of the records, this conflict didn't exist. It's about 150 years from when it happened. So the Saxons were historically a Germanic-speaking people. They were from northwestern Europe, and they're similar to what we would call Vikings. They weren't Vikings, but they're similar. They would raid. They're earlier than the Vikings were, but they would raid Roman river settlements. That's what they did for a long time. And then when the fall of the Western Roman Empire, so in 600 AD, around that time, there was a big migration of Saxon people to the British Isles. And so that's where like the term Anglo-Saxon comes from, because you would have, and they developed what we would call now as Old English. So kind of to give a cultural context of a literature context of that, is these are the people that wrote Beowulf. Yeah, so Beowulf comes from that Old English language, and which, like, if we read Old English today, untranslated, you can't understand it.
My senior English teacher in high school made the class read it in Old English, and she like gave us like a book on how to translate it, and like our homework every night was to try to translate it from Old English into our modern English, and it's
Jeez.
impossible.
Yeah, I mean, you can't understand it, like, unless. I mean, people spend whole careers. J.R.R. Tolkien, that was his big thing before Lord of the Rings, was he translated Beowulf. So they move to Great Britain, and essentially they become the government there. They're the early kings of Britain are Saxons. And this is kind of where also like the King Arthur legends come from. It's kind of this same dark period in English history where you've got Saxons and Romans, but you've also got like the Druids and the tribal people in Britain, and they're all kind of mixing together. You get a lot of legends that come out of this time because we don't have much history around it. So they're there for a few hundred years, and then the Normans were a group of people in northwest France from the province of Normandy. That's so, we know that because of D-Day and World War II. But Normandy is where they lived, and then they were also descendants of the Vikings. There were Viking raiders that came down from the Scandinavian countries and raided the Norman coast, and then they settled there. So they're living there. So these people all come from the same place originally. And so basically the Normans in 1066, they invaded England. They were led by William the Conqueror, and the big battle from that is the Battle of Hastings. So William the Conqueror is a French king, essentially, and he invades England and takes over. And it's actually, we were talking about the English language. Anglo-Norman and Anglo-Saxon are what got together to develop the English language as we know it today. That's why we have some words that are French and some words that are German. So like hearth is German, home is, I believe, German, house is German, but we have things like cuisine, which is French, but an English word, but is French. But it's a mixing of the two languages. And so the Normans settle. William the Conqueror is king of England. And then for the rest of history, pretty much until the Habsburgs, which would be William and Mary in England, which is like the 1600s, the Great Restoration. The kings in England are tied to the French monarchy. So the Plantagenets, the Tudors, this is where like a lot of the intermarrying and a lot of the stuff that makes British royalty weird happens. From this point on, the language spoken at court is French, which is important because the Robin Hood ballads were written in Middle English originally. So that's an important aspect because the courtly language was French. They were writing in the language of the common people, which is complicated because the people who were writing it obviously knew French because those were the only people that knew how to write. Were the nobles. So their kings, now with them, an aspect of the Robin Hood legend is there's a real big focus on poaching, which is like, seems silly to us, but in Saxon England, a noble could hunt wherever they wanted. It wasn't a big deal. Normans come and they bring an idea about the king's land. And so you can't hunt without permission from the king. And that's what sets this whole movie into action, is the poaching. So I thought that was interesting. That's something that didn't exist. But with all that said, this tension between the Saxons and the Normans didn't come about in the narrative until Ivanhoe, until Sir Walter Scott's book, which surprised me because I listened to a book that was like, now in retrospect, I'm like, I don't think that was a great source for a lot of things. But that's why I read multiple things. And the whole idea between the Saxons and the Normans, when the events that they're describing take place, it was about 150-ish years after the Norman invasion. By that time, everyone there was calling themselves English. There wasn't this delineation between Saxons and Normans because the nobles, everybody had intermarried, everybody had kind of merged the cultures together, which I thought was interesting because there's this whole thing about the Normans versus the Saxons, but Richard is a Norman. King Richard is a Norman. So it didn't make sense. Robin Hood is like, freedom for the Saxons, bring back the Norman king, This has just made more sense to me because I had a video game growing up called Robin Hood Defender of the Crown, and I used to play it, and I was like, okay, Friar Tuck, I know who that is. Maid Marian, I know who that is. Who the heck is Ivanhoe? I don't know who that is. Longchamp is a guy that's in the game. Like, there's a bunch of all these names. I'm like, oh, I get it now. Okay. I understand what this all comes from.
And I don't know if you've seen the 1952 Ivanhoe with Robert Taylor and Elizabeth Taylor. comes out on Blu-ray next month, which is very exciting, in Technicolor also. But that's one that was shown on TCM a lot when I was growing up, but I can't remember anything about it. But I have the Blu-ray on pre-order, so I will find out about it.
One of the reasons they think that Walter Scott injected that into it is because he was Scottish, and at the time he was writing this, there was a surge of Scottish nationalism. With Robert Burns was writing in the Scots dialect or language. This was a way for him to have his own brand of Scottish nationalism, but also be pro the union with Great Britain. Which, when I read that makes the whole dynamic make more sense, because Robin Hood is proud to be a Saxon, but he also supports the rightful king, which is a Norman. And that made more sense to me. But they don't explain that in the movie. But they also don't say Richard the Norman.
I just assumed he was Saxon. Yeah. That's what Robin Hood was fighting for.
Exactly. And that's the thing that doesn't... that like, we could open up a can of worms about King Richard. Because his legacy... Assume,
as an audience member, you should assume, because Prince John... Like, the Normans are evil in the movie. There is one-dimensional villains, one-dimensional heroes. And of course that was, 1930s movie making. But Prince John is a Norman because he's on the evil side. So I should have inferred that his brother was also a Norman. But because Robin Hood is fighting for the Saxons, you're like, Richard the Lionhearted, a Saxon, But it's like, no, that's not the case.
And Richard the Lionheart's interesting too, because as history has gone on, the opinions on him are mixed as well. Because he left England, most of his reign he spent in the Holy Land fighting a crusade, and kind of left England to do what it did. And it didn't go well. But I did find it noteworthy that so much of our perspective of Richard the Lionheart is influenced by the Robin Hood legend. Because Robin Hood likes him, so why we should. When historically, he wasn't everybody's favorite because he kind of went off fighting and didn't take care of his country. So
he went on a crusade for Christ, as we all have.
Yeah, he did. Then got kidnapped by a Christian monarch and held ransom by the Christian emperor of Europe. So,
and isn't that the goal of it? Every Christian crusade is for your heart to be held captive by a Christian monarch.
I've been listening, not recently, but in the past year, I listened to a lot of stuff on the Crusades, and they get complicated. It's not cut and dry, as nothing ever is, but there were crusades against other Christians, and you're like, why don't we ever talk about this?
And I mean, the lines of communication at that point, between everybody who was fighting against everybody else, I don't even know if everybody who was fighting against everybody else knew exactly what they were fighting for.
Yeah.
Because they don't have what we have today. So I would think that they were just fighting willy-nilly, some of them.
Another legend that I saw that is similar and kind of put into context with what Robin Hood is William Tell. William Tell, the crossbow and the apple on his son's head, and he shoots the apple off. That kind of comes from around the same time period and the same kind of motivations as the Robin Hood legend, but it's Dutch, I think. And that really, because I thought William Tell was a real person my whole life, and he's not. But it's kind of, it's one of those things in a similar way that King Arthur is, where it is a legend and myth that builds like a national identity. And we have those. I would put Robin Hood in the same category as Johnny Appleseed and Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill and those American myths that, were they a real person? Were they not? Because it's not quite like George Washington, where he was a real person, but he also has this mythos about him. It's more that it's like, well, maybe he was a real person, but that's not the point. The point is like, there's a very American spirit about that. And that's how I feel about Robin Hood and King Arthur too. This is a very British English identity. And that's what has elevated it to the level that it's at now.
Right. Exactly. But yet it's American enough for Disney to cover it. And all of the other.
I will say this movie, way more historically accurate than the Disney one. Robin Hood wasn't a fox.
So. No. And is it Prince John wasn't a lion? Or wait.
Prince John's a lion.
Okay. That's what I thought. I haven't seen it in a really long time. That's one I saw.
Which is a funny pun, because Prince John is a lion, but then Richard the Lionheart. That's his nickname. Well, is Richard a lion as well, or is he something else?
I was about to say, I haven't seen it. I saw it when I was 6, and then I haven't watched it again.
I used to have a crush on Maid Marian. Don't put that one in the podcast, but...
Well, no. We can talk about this, because every female that I talk two about the adventures of Robin Hood are madly in love with Robin Hood, and then all the men, are madly in love with Marian. So
I was talking about the fox, but
we were children. We needed something to be in love with.
Yeah, I guess so.
You have been listening to the Hollywood Babylonians. The Hollywood Babylonians